Power consumption, SSD versus HDD. In questions like this one and in websites everywhere, it's noted that SSDs use much less power than HDDs. Usually citing 2W versus 6W for HDDs. My question, and sorry if it's stupid, just need to be exact, is that per hour? Need to calculate cost savings and power consumption if we switched all our workstations to SSDs.
If your drive consumes 2 watts for 1 hour, it would have consumed 2 watt-hours of energy. A watt is merely a measure of power use. It's derived by multiplying voltage and current draw. A drive that runs at 12 V and draws 100 mA of current would consume 1.2 watts of power. To restate, if you ran that drive for an hour, you'd consume 1.2 watt-hours of power. In your case, 2 watts versus 6 watts, your cost would be 1/3 for an SSD versus HD. Calculations of time are unnecessary.
TLDR, it's not a cost-effective way to reduce your energy use, except on a laptop. 1 watt is equal to 1 joule, a unit of energy, per second. Watts measure the rate of energy transfer, power. You're billed, most likely, by amount of energy consumed, probably in kilowatt hours, kWh. That's equal to 1000 watts used for 1 hour, hence the name. You don't actually need to figure that out yourself, Google will do the math for you. That's 1 watt, used constantly, for 1 year, 24/7. You can multiply by 40 hours/week, etc. as needed. Google Calculator is pretty good at this kind of stuff. Now, the next problem you'll face is that neither HDD nor SSD are constant power devices. Both use more power when actually reading or writing than when sitting idle. And hard disks that are idle for a bit will spin down, and use almost no power. Further, SSDs are generally faster, so faced with the many workloads, we'll get back to idle sooner than HDDs. So you'd really have to measure to get a good number, as Brad Patton says. But, as an upper limit, let's take that 6 watts figure, and ask how much it actually costs to use it 40 hours per week, or year. Assume that a SSD uses no power. Google gives 13 kWh. Even if you're paying a fairly high rate, say 30 cents/kWh, that's under $4/year at over $100/SSD, even with a 0% discount rate, the payback period well exceeds the lifespan of the SSD. It's different on laptops. For example, my laptop runs on about 5 watts total. So saving even a fraction of a watt increases battery life noticeably.
You state 2 watts versus 6 watts SSD and HDD, that's peak power usage. If you are reading web pages, the SSD will be idle a lot of the time, whereas the HDD will spin. The SSD longevity is 1/4 longer than average HDD I've read, which relates to transport and production energy, and it uses less raw materials. At 50% idle time, the comparison is 1 watt versus 6 watts. For a laptop of 20 watts with 3 hours of battery, you would have 1/5 more battery life. It's about 30 minutes extra.
I was curious about this today, so I ran some numbers based on current technology. I looked at the spec for 2 Western digital drives, one HDD and one SSD. They state an average of 9.1 watt for the HDD and 0.06 watt for the SSD, 60 MW. At the current prices in my locale, it works out that the HDD costs about 62 cents per month and the SSD costs 0.4 cents per month to operate. The SSD saves $7.40 per year in electric costs if left on with load 24/7, but if power management is used, it would likely be more like $2. The math. Editorial. The biggest issue in recouping the cost are the price difference. If you can get away with the smallest SSD, let's say 120 GB, the current smallest HDDs are about the same price, $25, but are 500 GB. But a 120 GB is simply not sufficient for anything but basic usage. For simplicity, the cheapest 250 GB SSD is about $35 and 480 GB is about $65, which would take about 1.35 years and 5.4 years to break even on energy cost plus initial cost if the drives are in constant use 24/7, which would be rare in workplace client machines. So, ignoring that SSDs increase user productivity, it would make sense to buy 250 GB SSD over 500 GB HDD since it would save you a little bit of electrical costs. 480 GB SSDs would likely never recoup the price difference based on energy alone because of normal machine replacement cycles. But to me, the price of SSDs for client computers are easily offset by increased productivity, quicker boot, less waiting on documents to load, etc. Editorial Update 20,200,921. It no longer makes sense to even consider HDDs over SSDs if you only need a 250 GB or smaller capacity drive. 500 GB HDDs are hard to find. New and 1 TB is the current standard and they are priced almost identical to the 250 GB SSDs. Couple this is increasing electric costs, up 30% in my locale since I originally wrote this answer, and even a 480/500 GB SSD works out to be cheaper than a HDD.
Vielen Dank fürs Support, Herr Hamel. Lass es euch